10 people went missing after having been spotted either in or right around the outside of the heavily forested area inside of Bitsevsky Park. All of them were men. Their families went to police and reported them missing. The police did not launch an investigation. People just kind of accepted that whatever happened to these 10 men happened, and there's nothing any of us can do about it. 2 months after the 10th man had gone missing in the park, another man went missing in the park. And then by the end of the year, 4 more men had vanished inside of the park. And all of them vanished under the same circumstances. The police did not launch any investigation and blamed the missing people. The families kind of mourned the loss of these 5 men. Locals kind of gossiped about it for a little while, but when no new news came out about what happened to them, everyone just kind of moved on again. And unbelievably, this pattern would repeat itself for nearly 4 years. From 2002 to late 2005, 25 more people would go missing inside of Bitsevsky Park. One of them would be a woman. That put the total number of mysterious disappearances up to 40. But still, the police shrugged it off, and eventually, so too did the local population. Everyone just kind of moved on, like this phenomenon wasn't happening. But everything would change with missing person number 41, because unlike the previous 40, this missing person would be found again. 63-year-old Nikolai Zakharchenko was a retired police officer who lived in a tiny apartment in the southern Moscow suburbs with his family. And even though he was well aware of the missing person phenomenon, that wasn't about to stop him from doing the thing he loved, which was going on walks inside of this park. He figured whatever was out there, he could handle it. One evening in November of 2005, Nikolai told his sister that he was going to go out for a walk in the park. But that night, he didn't come back, and so his family was very worried about him, but they decided they would wait until the next morning to see if maybe he showed up. The following morning, when Nikolai did not show up, his family went to the police. But per usual, the police did nothing. A few days later, a local was walking fairly deep inside of the forest inside of Bitsevsky Park when they noticed well off the trail, off to the left side, there was something unusual kind of tucked in the underbrush. Now, this local was all alone, and so they called the police, and they reported seeing something strange. And surprisingly, the police did actually come out, and they went over to investigate, and they found Nikolai Zakharchenko. The police searched the area in hopes they might find the murder weapon or some other clue as to what happened to him, but there was nothing. And so all the police could deduce was that Nikolai had obviously been attacked, and that whoever his attacker was, or whatever his attacker was, had clearly snuck up on him, given the location of his injury. Now that the police had a body, they could no longer ignore the fact that so many people had gone missing inside of this park, and it was looking like they might find more bodies. So the local police called in reinforcements from Russia's Criminal Investigation Department, and they came to the southern Moscow suburbs. They began searching every inch of this park, looking for any indication of who or what was behind all these missing people. But after several days of a very extensive search, they found nothing. News about Nikolai's death had spread, and people were now getting really scared. Before, the fear of the park felt kind of theoretical because there were no bodies. But now, with the discovery that one of these missing people had been horrifically killed, that made the danger associated with this park feel very real. Most residents of these suburbs stopped going inside of this park in fear, and they gave this evil thing that lurked in the forest a name. They called it the Bitsevsky Park Maniac. But despite the fear of this maniac causing so many people to avoid this park, and despite the massive police presence that was in the park, people still continued to go missing, starting just a week after the discovery of Nikolai's body in November of 2005, all the way up to April of 2006, 9 more men would mysteriously vanish in the forested section of Bitsevsky Park. And just like Nikolai, they would be found lying out in the middle of the park. By this point, almost no one was stepping foot inside of the park. A serial killer is obviously on the loose in the forest. Despite this, there were still some very stubborn people who continued to go inside of the park. And one of those people was 32-year-old Alexander Pichushkin. It's safe to say Alexander's life had been more difficult than his peers. When he was just 4 years old, he fell backwards off of a swing, and when he sat up, he was okay, but the swing came swinging back and smashed him in the front of the head, causing brain damage. The injury had impaired his cognitive abilities, and years later, when he went to school, the other kids would bully him for sounding dumb. By the time Alexander was in high school, he felt like an outcast. He didn't have any friends, and he was miserable. But his grandfather, he noticed this about Alexander, and he decided he would take him under his wing and he would look after him. And he taught him how to play chess, believing that would be something they could bond over. And when he taught Alexander the rules of this game, Alexander immediately absorbed all this information about chess and became a master of it practically overnight. Within a couple of days of being taught how to play, he was beating his grandfather virtually every time they played together. And so he decided to bring Alexander down to Bitsevsky Park, where all these old men who were total chess masters were always playing chess. He brought Alexander down there and he put him up against all of these incredible players, and very quickly Alexander was wiping the floor with them. And they loved him for it. They totally adored him and they respected him. And when they found out he was getting bullied at school, they made a point of telling him that he would always have a place with them in this park. He finally felt like he was accepted, and he finally felt happy. Even after Alexander's grandfather passed away, Alexander continued to go down to Bitsevsky Park to play chess virtually every day. And he kept going to the park to play chess, even when men began going missing in the park, including some of the men he played chess with. Alexander's mother was terrified for him and felt like he didn't understand the risk he was putting himself in, but every time she pleaded with him not to go, just take one day off from playing chess, Alexander would say, "Mom, I'm gonna be fine." And then he would leave anyways. In April of 2006, Alexander was 32 years old and worked for a local grocery store stocking shelves. By this point, at least 50 people had vanished mysteriously in the forested section of the park, and 10 bodies had been found. On the morning of the 12th of that month, Alexander showed up to the grocery store for his shift, and right away he noticed there was a new employee. It was this beautiful older woman he had never seen before, and Alexander was not remotely confident around women. He had never had a girlfriend before. But he found himself looking at this woman across the store, feeling like she was different, that she was more approachable than other women. And so he told himself that day he was going to go up to her and he was going to say hi. And then at the end of his shift, the pair walked outside at the same time, and Alexander was about to say something, but he just couldn't find his voice. And then he noticed this woman had put a cigarette in her mouth, but she was fishing around for her lighter. And so Alexander jumped into action and pulled his own lighter out, and he held it out to her and said, "Hey, can I light your cigarette?" And so before long, the two were chatting and they were walking together. And over the course of their conversation, Alexander would learn this woman was named Larissa Koligina, and she was 48 years old, and she lived near Alexander's apartment. And so after they walked for a little while, they arrived in front of her apartment building. And at this point, Alexander knows she's about to go inside. And so he suddenly feels bold and he asks Larissa, "Hey, do you want to continue walking around with me for a bit and maybe do a pass through the park? This is a place that everyone in the area is basically terrified of." But for Alexander, Bitsevsky Park was like his happy place. And surprisingly, Larissa was very quick to say, "Oh, let's go to the park." Their first stop was the chess tables along the periphery of the park right outside of the forest. It seemed like it was time to turn around and leave, but neither Alexander nor Larissa wanted their date to end, and so they decided to follow a walking path that kind of looped into the forest and came back out again. And as they entered the woods and got deeper and deeper into the forest, the chess tables that were behind them faded from view, and the sky began to get darker and darker as it was getting late. As they talked and walked, the path below their feet stopped looking like the path they had originally set out on. And it's not really clear if they're on a marked trail anymore, but neither of them bring it up. They just maintain their kind of light conversation and continue walking as if nothing's going on. However, they both definitely began walking faster and faster. When it was very obvious they were no longer on a path, they both came to a stop. Alexander had been in front. He turned around and he looked at Larissa, and right away he could tell there was just something wrong about her. There was a look on her face that just didn't look right. She looked exhausted or sad or something. And then as he's looking at her, she inexplicably kind of collapses into a tree right next to her, and she grabs the tree with her arms and she slides down to its base and she presses her cheek and her chest up against its bark and she begins to cry. Alexander has no idea what's going on, so he just stands there staring at her. Larissa looks up at Alexander and says, "You're the maniac, aren't you?" Alexander couldn't believe it. She was the first person to figure it out so quickly. Normally, he would have to tell his victims before he killed them. And so he smirked and he looked at her and he said, "Yes, I am." She lets out this huge sob and she looks down and she keeps crying, and then she looks back up again at him and she says, "Are you going to kill me?" And without any hesitation, Alexander looks at her and he says, "Yes, I am." And then he reached into his jacket and he pulled out a hammer. No one knows for sure why Alexander became a serial killer or why he almost exclusively targeted men. Many people believe it might have something to do with the brain damage he suffered as a 4-year-old, that somehow that rewired his brain and made him more aggressive. Other than that injury, there really isn't much in Alexander's life that stands out as a big red flag. But in 1992, when he was 18 years old, he got this urge to kill and he actually decided to act on it. He brought up this desire to a classmate of his named Mikhail Odachuk, and surprisingly, Mikhail says to Alexander, "I want to kill someone too. Let's do it together." And so the two met up a couple of days later and they headed off to Bitsevsky Park and began walking around the forest looking for a lone person that could be their victim. Alexander, he's fully committed, but he can tell Mikhail is not. Alexander, he's getting more and more angry and frustrated with Mikhail until finally Alexander decides, "My first victim will be Mikhail." And so he turns to Mikhail and he says, "You know what? If you want to head back, you can." And so Mikhail turns around, and as soon as his back is to Alexander, Alexander pulls out his hammer, causing Mikhail to crumple to the ground. Alexander remembers that they had passed a little while earlier this well kind of hidden in the middle of the forest. And so he grabbed Mikhail's body and he dragged him. And when he got to the well, he pulled the lid off of it and dropped him inside. And Mikhail fell 30 feet all the way down to the icy water below. This well was an access point to this deep underground sewer system that stretched all around the underside of this park. He didn't just land at a pit of water right at the bottom of the well. Instead, he fell all the way down the shaft until it opened up like the bottom of a huge scientific beaker. And then his body was swept miles and miles away to some deep underwater recess where nobody was looking. Alexander would wait another 9 years before he killed again. His first kill after the hiatus was in the summer of 2001. His victim was a man he liked to play chess with. In fact, this was a man that loved Alexander and was definitely one of Alexander's friends. Alexander asked the man if he wanted to head into the forest to pay respects to his dog, who he had buried out in this forest. And so the pair begin walking into the forest. Eventually, they reach the well. And when they get to the well, Alexander stops and he kind of points to some arbitrary spot on the ground and says, "Oh, that's where my dog was buried." Alexander looks at his friend and kind of gestures with his arm to get the man to, take them back out of the forest. And so the man turns around and begins backtracking. And as soon as he does, Alexander pulls out his hammer, he walks up behind his friend, and then just like Mikhail, he drags this man's body and he dumps him into the well shaft, and then he puts the lid back on top. Alexander continued to lure his victims out to that well, and all of his victims were people he knew. They were his chess friends. They were his neighbors. They were anyone he had a personal relationship with. He would later say he liked to know the person he was killing. It made him feel like God. Not all of Alexander's victims who were chucked into that well actually died. Victims number 16 and 17, who were a pregnant woman and a 13-year-old boy respectively, after they got chucked into the well, their clothing got caught on a snag poking out of the inside of that 30-foot shaft, and it literally kept them from plummeting all the way into the water. And somehow, in both instances, Alexander didn't notice. He just put the well lid back on and walked away, believing they were both dead. And after they regained consciousness, they were able to kind of claw their way back up the well shaft and pulled themselves out of the well. Both victims would go to the police and both of them would positively identify who their attacker was. But the police didn't care. In fact, they told both of these victims that they needed to drop the charges and leave them alone. And if they didn't, the police would come up with something to have both of them arrested. And so Alexander got away with it, and the victims were literally intimidated by the police to stay quiet. And so that led to dozens and dozens more murders. In April of 2006, after Alexander told Larissa he was the maniac and he was going to kill her, he walked behind her and he wound up his hammer. 2 months later, Alexander would lure another woman out into the middle of the forest with him. Her name was Marina. She was 35 years old, and she had met Alexander while working at the grocery store with him. She actually was hired to fill Larissa's now vacant spot. Before Alexander and Marina began their walk out to the park, Marina said she just needed to stop by her apartment to let her son know where she was going. And so they swung by her apartment. Marina went upstairs and she left a note for her teenage son saying where she was going and who she would be with. And she even left behind Alexander's name and his phone number on this note. And so when she came back out again and she and Alexander began walking towards the park, Alexander knew that if he killed her, that he would certainly be caught. But by the time they were strolling into the forest, Alexander had decided he was going to kill her anyways. And many people believe he did this specifically to get caught because he wanted fame. He wanted recognition for what he had done. This theory stems from the fact that starting with his 41st victim, Nikolai Zakharchenko, Alexander began leaving his victims' bodies out in the open. He would prop them up in strange poses against trees, indicating he wanted the police to find them. That way, he could get all the credit he believed he deserved. When the police did finally arrest Alexander, they searched his apartment and they found this notebook. And in this notebook was a picture of a chessboard. This chessboard had 62 of the 64 squares filled in. And Alexander would explain to police that that was his scorecard. He had 62 victims. Alexander would be fully cooperative with police and would tell them every detail he could possibly remember about every single killing, including what conversations were like with the person he killed right before he killed them. He would also often reenact what he did to the person and how he felt afterwards. The police were only able to gather enough evidence to charge Alexander with 49 murders, not 60. And when Alexander heard this, he was totally disappointed, and he asked the judge if he could get credit for the other 11 murders to maintain his 60 victim mark. The judge said no. During his trial, Alexander was deemed to be such a threat, he was kept inside of a glass cage the entire time. And during the proceedings, he showed no remorse and in fact seemed kind of happy. He was ultimately given the harshest penalty under Russian law at the time, which was life in prison without parole, and the first 15 years of his life sentence would be in complete and total solitary confinement. Alexander is still alive today, and he is still in solitary confinement. Just know that I really appreciate your support, and until next time, that's going to do it. See ya.